6 days after the emergency C-section, the woman walked into the courtroom with her newborn child in her arms. The incision hadn't healed. Each step felt like a knife tearing across her lower abdomen. But she didn't stop. At the other end of the table, her husband, the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast of America. Beside him was his mistress, dressed in a red dress, ready to ascend to power. Luca Romano looked at the child. No smile, no question. Then he said, in front of everyone, "That child is no longer my responsibility." And that was the biggest mistake of his life. If you want to know who this woman is, watch until the end. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The elevator doors opened onto the 43rd floor, and Valentina Romano stepped out carrying her daughter like she was carrying a wound. Which she was. Literally. The surgical incision beneath her waistband had been closed with 17 staples 6 days ago, and right now, with every step across the marble lobby of the Meridian Tower, she could feel each one of them pulling. Not the sharp burn of fresh injury, something worse. The deep structural ache of a body that had been cut open and was not yet done, deciding whether it would heal. She didn't let it show. She had learned that before she learned to walk. The woman beside her, her attorney, Carmen Vega, 53 years old, hair gone silver at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like she'd forgotten them, reached out once as they crossed the lobby. Just a hand near Valentina's elbow. Not touching. Just there. Valentina didn't take it. "How many are already inside?" she asked. 12 confirmed, possibly 14. Carmen kept her voice flat. Lawyer voice. The voice that didn't tell you anything. 3 family representatives flew in last night. 2 of them I've never seen at anything below a senior council proceeding. Which families? Conti. Ferraro. A beat. And 1 man from the Delacroix group out of New Orleans. Valentina said nothing. She adjusted the blanket around Sophia's face. Cream-colored wool, soft enough that the baby's cheek didn't redden against it, and kept walking. Her heels made clean, deliberate sounds on the marble. Not the sound of a woman in pain, the sound of a woman who had decided what today was going to be. Valentina. Carmen stopped her just before the hallway to the tribunal suite. "I need to ask you one more time." "No." "If you give me 24 hours, no." She looked at her attorney directly. Carmen's eyes were careful, searching, doing the thing lawyers did when they were trying to assess how far gone a client was. "I've had 6 days, Carmen. Flat on my back in a hospital room while they sent flowers and then sent a process server. I've had enough time." Carmen held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and moved toward the door. The room beyond it was everything Valentina had expected and somehow still worse to walk into. Long mahogany table, crystal water glasses nobody had touched, recessed lighting set to the temperature of authority. Not warm, not cold, just relentlessly clear. The 12 men seated around the table had the careful stillness of men who had attended rooms like this many times before and knew better than to fidget. Some of them she recognized, some she recognized by reputation only. 1 or 2 looked at her with something she might have called sympathy if she'd been feeling generous. She wasn't. Luca sat at the far end of the table. She hadn't seen him in 6 weeks, not since the night she'd been admitted to St. Augustine's in early labor, bleeding and terrified, and he had not come. Not that night. Not the following morning. He'd sent Marco, his head of security, with a card signed in Luca's handwriting. "Get well. We'll discuss the rest when you're recovered." As if she'd had her appendix out. As if she hadn't just been cut open to save a life he'd spent 3 months claiming wasn't his. He looked the same. That was the thing that hit her in the chest, under the incision, somewhere she couldn't name. He looked exactly the same. Dark suit, silver at his temples, the kind that looked distinguished rather than old. The jaw she had once found beautiful still set with the same certainty, the same absolute assurance of a man who had never in his adult life sat in a room where he was not the most powerful person present. Beside him, Bianca Russo. She had come then. Valentina had wondered about that. Whether Luca would be smart enough to keep her out of the room, or whether he would be arrogant enough to bring her. The answer, apparently, was arrogance. Bianca sat to his right in a cream silk blouse that probably cost $3,000, her dark hair perfect. her expression arranged into something meant to project calm. She looked at Valentina when she entered, just once. Then she looked away. Valentina walked to the opposite end of the table and sat down. She set Sophia's carrier on the chair beside her, angled so the baby's face was visible to her but not to the room. Sophia was asleep. She slept through almost everything. Valentina had spent the last 6 days in a hospital watching her daughter sleep and understanding, with a clarity that frightened her, how much she was willing to do for that. Ricci, the tribunal's senior mediator, cleared his throat. He was 70 years old and had been conducting intra-family proceedings since before Valentina was born. He had also, she happened to know, accepted money from the Romano estate twice in the past decade. She had the records. "We are here," Ricci began, in the measured cadence of men who believe formal language constitutes fairness, to resolve the matter of the Romano marital dissolution and the associated claims regarding— "Before we proceed," Luca said. Ricci stopped. Everyone stopped. That was what happened when Luca Romano spoke in a room. The air itself seemed to wait. Luca didn't look at Valentina. He was looking at the table in front of him, and there was something in the quality of his stillness, something almost theatrical in its deliberateness, that she recognized from 15 years of marriage. He was performing. He did this when he needed the room to understand something before he said it aloud. He built the silence first. "I want it noted," he said, "that the child's presence in this proceeding is inappropriate and was not agreed to." Valentina watched him. "She's 6 days old," Valentina said. "I'm still breastfeeding. Unless you'd like to table this proceeding for another 8 weeks while I pump in whatever hotel room your people have been monitoring, I suggest we move forward." A sound from somewhere down the table. Not quite a laugh. Bianca's jaw tightened. Luca looked at her then. Finally. And what she saw in his face was not hatred. She had braced herself for hatred and found she could have lived with it, but something far more insulting. Assessment. The way he used to look at business proposals, calculating risk, measuring how much the thing in front of him could cost him. "Fine," he said. "Then let's be direct." He reached forward and opened the folder in front of him. His attorney, a man named Castellano who billed $700 an hour and had helped 3 crime families avoid federal prosecution over the past 2 decades, began to speak. The settlement, as presented, was a document that had clearly been drafted by someone who expected no resistance. The terms were these. Valentina would receive a monthly stipend, a residence in Westchester, held in trust, limited visitation with Sophia, defined as supervised visits on a schedule determined by a child welfare officer selected by— and this was the part that made Carmen's pen stop moving briefly before she continued— selected by the Romano family's legal team. No claim to Romano business interests. No claim to Romano family properties or holdings. Full non-disclosure. The agreement characterized Valentina's role in the marriage as domestic, and her contributions as personal in nature and not constitutive of business partnership. And regarding Sophia, paternity remains contested pending resolution of genetic verification proceedings currently under appeal. Valentina had read this language 3 times in the hospital. She had read it until the words became shapes without meaning. Then she had let them mean something again, and she had felt the anger move through her like a clean, cold current, and she had understood what she was going to do. She waited until Castellano finished speaking. Then she looked at Ricci. "May I?" He gestured for her to proceed. Carmen opened her own folder. "We'll begin," Valentina said, "with the hospital records." The first document was simple. St. Augustine's Medical Center, admission records, date of Valentina Romano's emergency C-section. Attached to it, fetal monitoring logs from the preceding 48 hours, showing documented communication from Valentina's medical team to 3 numbers, her personal physician, Carmen Vega, and the primary number registered to Luca Romano's personal device. He had been notified 3 times over 2 days. He had not responded to the hospital directly. "This establishes," Carmen said, placing the document on the table, "that Mr. Romano was informed of the medical emergency and made no contact with the hospital or with his wife for a period of 71 hours following the birth of his child." Luca's expression didn't change. He had expected this. He was prepared for this. That was fine. Valentina watched him while Carmen moved to the second document. The encrypted messages were the ones that changed the room's temperature. They had been obtained legally. Valentina's own device, her own accounts, communications sent to her over the course of 7 months. What they showed, systematically and in language that was often breathtaking in its coldness, was the architecture of a campaign, not a marriage failing, not two people growing apart, a structured effort coordinated between Luca and at least 2 members of his inner circle to position Valentina as unstable in the period following childbirth, to build a documented record that could be presented in custody proceedings as evidence of postpartum psychological instability. There were messages discussing which of his captain's wives might be willing to provide statements. There were messages about surveillance, about monitoring her phone activity, her social contacts, her medical appointments. There was a thread, 3 months long, in which Luca and Castellano discussed the precise legal threshold in New York State for challenging a mother's fitness for primary custody. And there was one message sent 8 weeks before Sophia's birth in which Luca had written, "She still thinks the paternity question is real. Keep it that way. We need her uncertain." The room was quiet in a different way now, the kind of quiet that happens when people are recalculating. Bianca's face had gone very still. She was reading the message summary that Carmen had placed on the table. Valentina watched her read it, watched the moment Bianca reached the specific line, "She still thinks the paternity question is real," and saw something shift behind her eyes. "These communications," Castellano said, recovering first, "were obtained through means that may not be—" "They were obtained from Mrs. Romano's own devices," Carmen said pleasantly. "Communications sent to her, by your client. We didn't touch his phone." Luca had gone somewhere behind his face. She had seen him do this before, in negotiations, in moments of serious threat. This interior retreat, this drawing back into the absolute center of himself where nothing showed. His hands were flat on the table. Still. She looked at his hands and remembered them and hated the fact that she still could. Ricci was looking at the documents. He had the expression of a man who had been paid to stand in a particular place and was now standing in it while the ground shifted under his feet. "We should recess," Ricci said. "We're not finished," Valentina said. Her voice was quiet. She had worked on that. In the hospital, lying in the adjustable bed with Sophia asleep on her chest and the staples in her abdomen, and the night nurses moving soft as ghosts outside the door, she had thought about how her voice needed to sound today. Not loud, not broken, not angry in the way that could be reframed as hysteria. Quiet with the specific quality of a woman who has already decided and is now simply executing. "There is one more element," she said, "that the tribunal should hear before any recess." She looked at the men around the table, at the family representatives, Conti, Ferraro, the Delacroix man she had met once, 7 years ago, at a dinner in New Orleans that Luca thought he'd arranged through his own contacts. She let her gaze move around the table with a deliberateness that she had also practiced. Not aggression, recognition, the acknowledgement of people you already know before they know you. Then she said, "My name is Valentina Moretti Romano. My grandfather was Enzo Moretti." The Delacroix man's head came up. She saw it happen to the Conti representative a half-second later. Slow, like a man surfacing from deep water. Then Ferraro, older, balder, slower, and then the comprehension moved around the table in a wave she could almost see. Enzo Moretti had been dead for 11 years. The Moretti Syndicate, as it was known in certain rooms and never spoken of in others, had not operated under that name in longer than that. It had been restructured, redistributed, moved into channels that looked, from the outside, like legitimate international finance. But it had not dissolved. It had simply become, as all truly durable power eventually becomes, invisible. "I am," Valentina continued, "the sole direct heir to the Moretti Holdings, the Associated Alliance Network, and all agreements negotiated under the Moretti name since 1987. She kept her voice level. "Including the agreements that currently underpin approximately 40% of the Romano family's operational infrastructure." Luca's stillness broke. It was small, a shift of weight, a fractional change in the set of his shoulders. But she had been watching for it, and she caught it, and she held it the way you hold something fragile and devastating that you've waited a long time to pick up. That's, he started. Documented, Carmen said, and placed the final folder on the table. Extensively. Sophia made a small sound in her carrier. Not a cry, just the unconscious murmur of a sleeping infant adjusting to some private dream. Valentina reached over without looking and laid one hand on the edge of the carrier, and felt the warmth radiating through the wool blanket, and did not look away from her husband. Her almost former husband, the man who had built an empire on ground he thought he owned. I suggest, Valentina said, that we take that recess now. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard since the night the anesthesia wore off, and she first held her daughter in the blue-gray light of the recovery room and understood, in a way she had not understood anything before, what survival actually meant. Around the table nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Luca Romano sat at the head of the table he had dominated for 15 years and looked at the woman at the other end of it, and for the first time since Valentina had known him, she could not read his face at all, which meant he was afraid, which meant she had only just begun. But then Carmen leaned toward her and said something low and quick against her ear. 4 words, in a voice that was careful the way a hand on a wound is careful. And Valentina's breath changed. Because the 4th person who had walked through the door behind them, while everyone was watching Luca, while everyone was watching her, was someone who was not supposed to be in this room. Someone who was supposed to be in federal custody. Someone whose presence here meant that one of the documents in Carmen's folder, one specific document, the most important one, had already been seen by someone who should not have seen it. Valentina kept her face still. She pressed her hand gently against her daughter's carrier and felt the warmth through the wool and breathed through her nose and did not let a single thing she was thinking reach her expression. But her heart was hammering because she had prepared for Luca. She had not prepared for this. The man standing in the doorway was named Vincent Caruso, and he was supposed to be sitting in a federal holding facility in Newark waiting for a bail hearing that wasn't scheduled until Thursday. Valentina knew this because she had arranged it, not directly. She had never done anything directly in her life. That was the first thing her grandfather had taught her, in the study of the Moretti house in Connecticut, when she was 9 years old and he was explaining to her the difference between power that announces itself and power that simply is. You do not push the door open, Enzo Moretti had said, in the particular voice he used for things that mattered. You remove the hinges, then wait for someone else to push. She had removed Vincent Caruso's hinges 6 weeks ago, through a chain of 3 intermediaries and a carefully placed piece of financial evidence that had found its way to a specific desk at the FBI's Organized Crime Division. The evidence was real. The timing of its arrival had been engineered. He should not be standing in this doorway. Carmen was still close to her ear. He walked in through the service entrance with Castellano's second chair. Nobody stopped him. A pause. I think they knew he was coming. Valentina looked at Luca. Luca was looking at the document still spread in front of him. His jaw was set. He had not looked up when the door opened behind Valentina, which meant he had heard it. He heard everything, always, that was not an accident, and had chosen not to react visibly, which meant Caruso was his, which meant someone inside her chain had broken. She turned in her chair. Not fast. Deliberately. The way you turn when you want the room to understand you are not surprised. Even when your pulse is doing something ugly behind your sternum and your incision is burning from sitting too long in a chair that wasn't designed for a woman 6 days out of surgery. Vincent Caruso was 51 years old and built like someone who had spent his 20s lifting things that were too heavy for him and his 40s paying for it. He had thick gray-brown hair and a face that looked like it had been arranged rather than grown, like someone had assembled the features of a reasonable man and fallen slightly short. He was the Romano family's senior financial architect, had been for 11 years. He controlled the accounting infrastructure that ran beneath Luca's operations like a root system, invisible, essential, the thing that made everything above ground possible. He was also the man who had, 8 months ago, come to Valentina with a specific request. He had needed her help accessing a Moretti-affiliated banking channel in Geneva. A quiet transfer, a rebalancing, he'd called it, between 2 accounts that technically belonged to different entities, but were both under Romano operational control. He had told her Luca had authorized it. He had shown her documents with Luca's signature. She had helped him. She had also kept copies of everything, including the documents he'd shown her with Luca's signature, which she had subsequently had examined by a forensic document specialist who determined that the signature was real, but the authorization language surrounding it had been altered after signing. She had that report in Carmen's folder, or she had thought she did. She looked at Carmen now. "The Caruso documents," she said quietly. Carmen's expression did something controlled and terrible. "They're there." "Are they?" A half-second delay. The kind that happens when a lawyer is doing rapid internal arithmetic. "I verified the folder this morning." "Verify it now." Carmen opened the folder on the table with the careful movements of someone who is not going to let their hands shake. She paged through, stopped, paged back. Her face gave nothing away to the room, but Valentina was close enough to see the small tightening at the corner of her mouth. "They're there," Carmen said again, but her voice was a degree quieter than it had been. Valentina turned back to face the room. Caruso had moved. He was no longer in the doorway. He had crossed to the side of the room, not to the table, not taking a seat, just positioning himself along the wall the way security personnel do when they want to be present without being formally part of the proceeding. Castellano had glanced at him once and returned to his notes. The family representatives were watching with the careful attention of men at a match where the score has just become unclear. Ricci said, with the resignation of a man who has seen too many rooms become more complicated than he was paid for, "I'm going to need a 10-minute recess." "We're not recessing," Luca said. He was still looking at the documents, still not looking at Valentina. That was the tell. For 15 years she had known that when Luca stopped looking at something, it meant he was thinking hardest about it. He was thinking about her very hard right now. "We have a full schedule and we're going to keep it. Vincent." He said the name without raising his voice. "Take a seat or step outside." Caruso stepped outside. The door closed behind him. The air in the room changed. Not improved exactly, but clarified. The shape of the threat became somewhat clearer by his absence. Ricci poured himself water. His hand was steady. She gave him credit for that. "Mrs. Romano," he said, "you were presenting documentation regarding the Moretti family holdings. I think it would be appropriate before we continue to address the standing of those claims, since they are, I think everyone here would agree, somewhat extraordinary in their scope." "Of course," Valentina said. She reached into her bag, the one she'd carried into this room that looked like a simple leather tote and contained, besides Sophia's things, a secondary set of every document in Carmen's folder, and placed a bound packet on the table. She slid it to the center. That packet contains the succession documentation for the Moretti holdings. It includes the original family trust instruments, the 2009 restructuring filings, and the certified genealogical records establishing my direct line of inheritance. It also includes a letter of recognition signed by 7 senior members of the Moretti Advisory Council in 2021, 3 months before my grandfather's estate was formally closed. The Conti representative picked up the packet. He was reading it with the focused attention of a man who knows what he's looking at. "Why?" said a voice from down the table, one of the men she didn't recognize personally, a Ferraro associate, younger than the rest of them, with the slightly too polished look of someone whose education had been expensive and whose experience hadn't caught up yet. "Why would the Moretti heir have been operating as a—" He stopped. Recalibrated. Why would someone with that inheritance have maintained silence about it for 15 years? She looked at him. "Because my grandfather built the Moretti network on one principle above everything else." She kept her voice patient. She did not feel patient, but she kept her voice that way. "The most dangerous power is the power no one knows to defend against." The younger man held her gaze for a moment and then looked down at his notes. Luca made a sound. Not quite a laugh. More like the exhale of a man who has heard something that hits a nerve he wasn't planning to expose. "Enzo Moretti," he said. He said the name the way you say the name of something that has been dead long enough to safely mock. "You want these men to believe that you have been sitting on a syndicate inheritance for 15 years and said nothing, not once. In 15 years of marriage, not even—" He stopped. "Not even when you were humiliating me in front of every captain and capo on the East Coast?" she said. You can finish the sentence, Luca. We're among colleagues. The room was very quiet. Luca looked at her now. Full eye contact for the first time since she'd entered the room, and she had been right. It was different. Something in his face had cracked open slightly, like a fault line under a road that's fine right up until it isn't. He was angry. He was angry in the specific way of a man who has just realized he has been underestimating something for a very long time and cannot decide whether to be angrier at the thing or at himself. "You should have told me," he said. It was such a strange thing to say. In this room, in front of these people, in the wreckage of everything they had done to each other, that for a moment she didn't respond. She looked at him and thought about the night Sophia was born, and the silence from his phone and the card signed in his handwriting, and the process server who had come while her catheter was still in. "Yes," she said finally. "I should have." She did not say what she meant, which was, "I should have told you so you would have been afraid of me from the beginning, and then you would have treated me differently, not because you were a better man, but because you were afraid." She didn't say it because she didn't need to, and because some part of her was still not past the grief of what it meant. That fear was the only language that would have worked, and that she had loved him enough, for long enough, to want a different language to be possible. That was done now. Castellano cut in. Mr. Romano's question regarding disclosure is actually legally relevant. If Mrs. Romano deliberately concealed material assets and connections during the course of the marriage, "She wasn't concealing assets," Carmen said, in the tone that lawyers develop when they are tired of other lawyers. The Moretti holdings were held in a separate trust that predated the marriage. Under New York law, separate property retained in trust does not become marital property, regardless of disclosure. I'm happy to walk you through the relevant statutes. "That's not the point," Castellano said. "Then what is the point, Marcus?" Carmen said his first name the way you use a blade. "The point is that your client knew about the Geneva transfer. He signed the authorization, and then someone altered the document around his signature. We have the forensic report. Would you like me to put it on the table now? Or would you prefer to have a private conversation with your client first so he can explain to you why his signature is on an altered document authorizing an unauthorized transfer from a Moretti-affiliated account?" The temperature in the room dropped about 5 degrees. Castellano put down his pen. Luca's hands, flat on the table, went very still. Bianca Russo had been silent for 20 minutes. She sat beside Luca with her posture perfect, and her expression doing the work of performing calm, and Valentina had been tracking her in peripheral vision the whole time because Bianca was not stupid. That was the thing that was easy to miss about her, underneath the aesthetics and the performance of the role she'd slid into. She was not stupid, and she had been listening to every word and doing her own arithmetic. Now Bianca picked up the message summary that Carmen had placed on the table earlier, the one with the thread about the paternity question. She read it again, or read a specific part of it again. Her nail, dark red, squared off, not quite touching the paper, moved along a particular line. She still thinks the paternity question is real. Keep it that way. Bianca put the document down. She looked at Luca. "You told me," she said. Her voice was very controlled, the kind of control that is very close to the edge of something else. "You told me the paternity test was genuinely in question. You told me you weren't sure the child was yours." Luca didn't look at her. "This isn't the time." "You told me you had doubts." Her voice had not risen, but something in the texture of it had changed. "You told me you needed to protect yourself because you didn't know if the baby was yours. That's why you asked me to—" She stopped, looked at the document again. "That's what you told me." "Bianca, you used me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even quite an accusation. It was more like a fact being turned over for examination, the way you look at something you've been holding for a long time and are only now seeing clearly. "You told me she was unstable, and you didn't know if the child was yours, and you needed my help building a record because she would try to use the pregnancy to—" She stopped again. "There's a line in here about getting statements from captains' wives. Did you ask me to talk to Elena Conti because you wanted a statement about Valentina's behavior? We'll discuss this later." "Did you?" Luca turned to look at her. His expression had flattened into the specific blankness he used as warning. Most people who saw that expression stopped talking. Bianca Russo looked at it for a long moment, and then looked back at the document in front of her and did not stop. I told Elena that Valentina had been acting erratically, Bianca said, mostly to the table now. I told her I was worried about her. Elena told her husband. She looked up and found Marco Conti's representative at the table. The older man met her gaze without expression. Did he pass it to you? The concern about Valentina's stability? The Conti representative said nothing, but the slight forward adjustment of his weight was enough. You built a case, Bianca said, and now she was looking at Luca again, and the performance of calm was not entirely holding. You built a case, and you used me to build it, and you told me the baby wasn't yours. A breath. She had an emergency C-section, Luca. I know what she had. You didn't go to the hospital. I was in the middle of... You didn't go to the hospital. Not louder, just repeated. Differently. Like she was putting it down somewhere that couldn't be moved. She almost died, and you sent Marco with a card. Castellano put his hand on Luca's arm. Lawyer gesture. Stop talking. Luca looked at the hand and then at Castellano, and then he looked at the table and said nothing. Bianca stood up. It was a quiet movement. She picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair, and she put the strap over her shoulder, and she looked at Valentina for the first time since the start of the proceeding. Not with guilt exactly, not with sympathy exactly, with something more complicated and less comfortable than either of those things. I have a statement, Bianca said, to the room, to Ricci specifically. I'll provide it in writing, whatever format is required. She looked at Castellano. I'll need separate representation. She looked at Luca one more time. His face was stone. I'm sorry, she said, and it wasn't clear who she was talking to. Then she walked to the door, opened it, and left. The room sat with that for a moment. Carmen was writing something on her legal pad. Valentina watched the door close and felt something she hadn't expected, which was not satisfaction. She had expected satisfaction, and found instead something quieter and heavier, the specific exhaustion of being right about something you would rather have been wrong about. Sophia shifted in her carrier. A small sound, not quite a cry, the sound of an infant at the edge of hunger. Valentina reached over without looking and found the edge of the blanket and tucked it back around her daughter's feet. Ricci said, with the voice of a man who wants very much to be somewhere else, I think we should recess for the afternoon and reconvene. The door opened again. Not Bianca, not Caruso. A man Valentina did not recognize, in a dark suit that was not expensive enough for this room, carrying a leather case that he held differently from how lawyers hold leather cases. He crossed to Ricci and bent down and said something against the older man's ear that made Ricci's face go very careful and still. Then Ricci straightened and said, There is a federal matter. An agent from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division is requesting access to this proceeding on the basis of an active investigation connected to... He stopped, looked at the paper the man had given him, looked up. Connected to the Romano family's foreign financial operations, specifically accounts connected to a Geneva-based holding entity. The Geneva transfer, the document Caruso had brought to Valentina 8 months ago, the altered authorization, the Moretti-affiliated account. Someone had moved first. She looked at Luca. He was looking at the man in the insufficient suit, and his face had gone to somewhere she had never seen it go before, not in 15 years, not in the worst of their fights or the coldest of their silences. He looked like a man who has just realized that the floor underneath him was not floor. Carmen leaned toward Valentina again, close. The forensic report, she said, very quiet. It's not in the folder. Valentina kept her face absolutely still. What? She said, so low it was barely sound. The Caruso forensic report. The copy in our folder is the original draft, the final version, the one with the authentication signatures. I certified it this morning at 8:15. It should be in the folder. Carmen paused. It's not in. The folder was wrong. Carmen said it again, barely sound, the words pressed flat between her teeth. The authentication signatures. They're not there. Valentina did not move, did not blink. did not let anything that was happening inside her chest reach her face, because the room was still full of people who were watching everything. And the federal agent in the insufficient suit was still standing beside Ricci. And Luca was still sitting at the far end of the table looking at the floor like a man trying to find solid ground that wasn't there. She breathed in through her nose, counted to 3, breathed out. "When did you last physically confirm the final version?" she said. 8:15 this morning. I had it in my hand. I put it in the folder myself. Carmen's pen was not moving, but she was holding it hard enough that the knuckle of her index finger had gone white. "Valentina, someone has been in my files." The federal agent straightened up from Ricci's ear and addressed the room. His name, he said, was Special Agent Doran, Financial Crimes Division, and he was not here to disrupt a private proceeding, but to serve notice that an active investigation connected to transactions originating from a Geneva-based account. He used an account number that Valentina recognized the way you recognize the sound of something breaking, required the preservation of all related documentation currently in the possession of parties in this room. He had a document. He placed it on the table. It was a federal preservation order. Castellano picked it up, read it, and put it back down with the careful neutrality of a man who has just understood something he wished he didn't. Luca said nothing. Valentina looked at the preservation order from across the table and did the arithmetic with the speed of someone who had been doing this kind of arithmetic since childhood. The Geneva account flagged in the order was the same account Caruso had used for the transfer 8 months ago. The forensic report she no longer had authenticated copies of was the document establishing that the authorization for that transfer had been forged around Luca's real signature. Without the authenticated version, the draft in Carmen's folder was just a draft, the kind of thing any competent defense attorney could characterize as preliminary, uncertified, speculative. Without it, she didn't have Luca for the transfer. Without the transfer, she didn't have Caruso as a direct line back to Romano financial fraud. Without Caruso, the federal investigation would proceed, but it would proceed without her evidence, which meant it would proceed along whatever path the Bureau had built independently, which she didn't control, which meant she didn't know where it ended. She looked at Vincent Caruso's empty chair along the wall. He had come in. He had positioned himself. He had left when Luca told him to. He had not come here to observe. He had come here to confirm that the thing he had taken was the right thing. She had underestimated him. That was the truth of it, and it tasted exactly as bad as the truth usually did. She had looked at Vincent Caruso and seen a man who was afraid of her because she had evidence against him, because she controlled his exposure. She had not looked hard enough at whether his fear of her was greater than something else, whether someone had offered him a way out of her reach. Someone had. Agent Doran collected the signed acknowledgments from Ricci and Castellano. Valentina's copy went to Carmen, who signed it without expression, and then he said he would be in contact and left the room as plainly as he had entered it. The door closed. Ricci said he needed water and drank most of the glass without putting it down. The Conti representative was talking quietly to the man beside him. The Ferraro associate was on his phone with the furtive speed of someone who thinks they're being subtle and isn't. The Delacroix man was watching Valentina with an expression that was not hostile and not sympathetic, but assessing, the way people from certain kinds of families look at situations. Not judging yet, just measuring. Luca stood up. It was a simple movement, but it changed the room. The way his movements always changed rooms. The specific gravitational quality of a man who has spent decades being the largest force in every space he occupied. He stood up and he buttoned his jacket and he looked at Valentina from the length of the table. "I think," he said, "we should take that recess." His voice was back. Whatever had cracked open in it 20 minutes ago had been closed again. She didn't know how he did that, and she had never known. It was possibly the thing she had hated most about him. Not the cruelty, not the calculation, but the speed at which he could close himself back up after you'd seen inside. 30 minutes, Ricci said, with the relief of a drowning man handed a rope. The room began to move. Chairs scraped. Conversations that had been suppressed during the proceeding broke open in low, urgent clusters. Carmen was already on her phone before she fully stood up, one hand pressed flat on the table, speaking in the clipped half-sentences she used when she was managing a crisis and needed to move faster than complete syntax allowed. Valentina picked up Sophia's carrier. The weight of it? 7 pounds, 4 ounces, plus the carrier itself, plus the blanket, and the small stuffed rabbit Carmen's paralegal had tucked in as a joke 2 days ago, and which Sophia had somehow already developed a preference for, sent a pull through her abdomen that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite not. She breathed through it and stood and followed Carmen toward the side door that led to the small anteroom designated for their use. The anteroom was a corporate waiting room that had been cleared and given a small table and 2 chairs and a carafe of coffee that nobody had touched. Carmen closed the door and turned, and Valentina sat down and set the carrier on the table and looked at her attorney. "Tell me," Valentina said. "I need 20 minutes to, Carmen, tell me now." Carmen sat. She put her phone face down on the table, and she looked at Valentina with the expression of a lawyer who has stopped performing and started just being a person, which was one of the more frightening things Valentina had ever seen her do. "The authenticated report was the only copy with evidentiary standing," Carmen said. "The draft version is in the folder. That's what I confirmed at 8:15. I had the authenticated version on top of the draft in a single sleeve. When I rechecked just now, the authenticated copy is gone. The draft is still there. Someone removed one sheet from an inside sleeve of a folder that was in my physical possession or in the locked case in my car for the entire morning," which means either your office or your car. "My car was in the parking structure here from 7:45. Who has access to your office between 7:45 and when you left?" "My paralegal, 2 associates. The cleaning service comes at 7, but they're finished by 7:30. She stopped. "And Daniel?" Valentina looked at her. "Daniel? My second chair. He was in early. I saw him when I arrived." Carmen's voice had gone very flat. "He left before I did, said he had to pick something up." "Has he ever worked with Castellano's firm?" Carmen's mouth tightened. "He clerked for one of Castellano's partners 4 years ago, before he came to me." Valentina looked at the carafe of coffee and thought about what it felt like to have trusted the construction of a thing and then to discover the construction was wrong. Not the materials, but the materials were solid, the structure, the joins, the places where one piece connected to another, and you had assumed the connection would hold. "Can we reconstruct?" she asked. "The forensic specialist who produced the report, Dr. Haas, she's in Philadelphia. I can reach her this afternoon. She'll have her own copy of the authenticated version. The question is whether it can be entered into evidence in a proceeding that has already begun without authentication of the chain of custody. Ricci won't accept it without a fight from Castellano." "No. So we lose the transfer documentation for today?" "For today, yes." Valentina leaned back in the chair. The fluorescent light above them had a slight flicker, almost imperceptible, the kind that doesn't bother you until you notice it and then bothers you continuously. She looked at the light and breathed and listened to Sophia's small sounds and thought about her grandfather. Enzo Moretti had told her in the same study where he'd explained the hinges and the door, "The second principle is this. Every plan has a seam. The people who build plans spend all their time reinforcing the center, and they forget the seam. Your job is never to forget where your seams are." She had forgotten where her seam was. She had been so focused on Luca, on the paternity documentation, the message threads, the Moretti succession papers, that she had treated the Caruso evidence as a secondary weapon, solid and secured, and she had not checked the seam. "What about the federal investigation?" she asked. "Doran's preservation order means they're building independently. Whatever they have, they weren't here to share it with us. They were here to make sure we don't destroy anything." Carmen paused. "Which also means someone told them this proceeding was happening today." "Caruso." "Probably. He's positioned himself as a cooperative witness, which means he's already made a deal, or is negotiating one." Carmen looked at her. "If he's offering them Romano financial operations in exchange for immunity, they don't need our report. They need us to not muddy the evidentiary waters. And our report muddles them. Our report puts a Moretti-affiliated account at the center of a Romano criminal fraud. The Bureau wants Romano. They may not want the Moretti connection made explicit in open proceedings." Valentina was quiet for a moment, then, "They want me to stay out of it." That's my reading. And if I don't? Carmen held her gaze. Then a federal prosecutor gets to decide whether your role in the Geneva transfer, as the person who authorized Caruso's access to the Moretti account, regardless of the deception involved, constitutes participation in the underlying fraud. The fluorescent light flickered. Sophia made a sound. Valentina looked at her daughter, eyes still closed, fist curled near her cheek, the way it always was, as if she was holding something small and important even in sleep. Valentina stood up. She crossed to the door, opened it 2 inches, and looked into the hallway. Empty. The sounds of the proceeding room, low conversation, the movement of chairs, came from around the corner. She closed the door. "I need to make a call," she said. "To who?" She didn't answer. She took out her phone, not the one she used every day, the one that lived in her bag with her wallet and her daughter's things, but a second one, older, that she had carried for 3 years in a zippered inner pocket and used for perhaps a dozen conversations total. She turned it on, waited for it to connect. Carmen watched this with the expression of a lawyer recalibrating in real time how much she might not know about her own client. The number Valentina dialed was a New York number. It rang 4 times. A woman answered, not young. The voice had the particular weight of someone who has spent a long time being careful. "Yes." "It's Valentina. I need to speak to him." A pause. "He's not available today." "Tell him about the preservation order. He'll be available." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Hold." Carmen was very still. The kind of still that lawyers get when they are deciding whether to ask a question or whether they would prefer not to know the answer. The line clicked. A new voice. Male. Older. With an accent that wasn't quite New York and wasn't quite anything else. The accent of someone who had spent a long time speaking in rooms where the language was not his own. Valentina. He said her name the way her grandfather used to say it. Not warmly. As a fact. "This is unexpected. I know, I'm sorry to—" "Don't apologize, tell me." She told him, concisely. The missing document, Caruso, the federal agent, the preservation order, the account number that appeared in that order. She kept her voice level and her sentences short, and she did not editorialize. He had known her since she was 12 years old, and he would hear what she needed him to hear without her having to underline it. When she finished, there was silence. Then he said, "The account number they cited?" "Yes. That account was restructured in 2019. "I know. After the restructuring, the controlling entity changed. It is no longer technically a Moretti account. The assets were transferred, but the controlling interest passed to a new entity." Another pause. "The new entity is registered in Delaware. Do you know the name of it?" She did not know the name of it. She had not known the account was restructured. She had believed, when Caruso came to her with the transfer request, that the account was still under Moretti operational control. She had believed that because Caruso had told her it was, because the documents he'd shown her said it was, because she had verified with a contact who she now understood might have been working from old information, or, and this was the possibility that was opening in her chest like something cold, might not have been her contact at all by that point. "Tell me the name," she said. He told her. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She stood in the fluorescent-lit anteroom of the Meridian Tower with her sleeping daughter on the table beside her and her attorney watching her face and the phone pressed to her ear, and she held the name in her mind and turned it over and understood what it meant. The Delaware entity that had assumed controlling interest of the Geneva account, the account at the center of the federal investigation, the account Caruso had used, the account her own access had helped fund a fraudulent transfer through, was registered to a holding company. That holding company's listed principal officer was a name she recognized. It was not Luca's name. It was not Caruso's name. It was Carmen Vega. Valentina looked at her attorney. Carmen was watching her with those careful eyes, those eyes that had been careful for so long, and something in the way she was sitting, very still, hands flat on the table, the professional composure that Valentina had always read as competence and was now reading differently, was wrong. Had been wrong, possibly, for longer than today. "Thank you," Valentina said into the phone. Her voice did not shake. She did not know how, but it didn't. "I'll be in touch." She ended the call. She looked at Carmen. Carmen looked back at her. And in the space between one breath and the next, something changed in Carmen's face. Not a collapse exactly, not guilt, more like the precise moment when a person decides that maintaining a performance is no longer worth the energy it costs. The careful expression didn't fall away. It simply became unnecessary, like a coat taken off in a warm room. "How long?" Valentina asked. Carmen said nothing. "How long have you been working with him?" "Valentina?" "With Luca." "How long?" Not a question anymore. The words were very flat and very clean, and Valentina could hear her own heartbeat and the small breathing sounds of her daughter and the distant muffled noise of the world outside this room, going about its business completely indifferent to the fact that everything she had built and every move she had made for 6 months had been fed, in real time, to the man she was trying to. Carmen said, 3 years. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Not loud, just final. 3 years. Valentina did the math without wanting to. 3 years ago, Sofia had not existed yet. 3 years ago, she and Luca were still sharing a bed, still attending family dinners, still performing the architecture of a marriage that she had believed was damaged but repairable. 3 years ago, she had hired Carmen Vega on the recommendation of a Moretti family contact she had trusted for a decade, and Carmen had spent those 3 years sitting across from her in offices and hospital rooms, and now this fluorescent anteroom, listening to everything and carrying it back. "He approached you," Valentina said. Not a question. Establishing sequence. She needed sequence right now because sequence was the only thing she could control. "Yes." "Through Castellano?" "Through a mutual colleague. Someone I'd worked with on an estate matter in 2018. Carmen's voice had changed. Not guilty exactly. More like someone reading from a document. Affectless. The voice people use when they've decided the pretending is done, and what's left is just the facts. It started as information sharing, peripheral. Nothing that would hurt you directly. And then it wasn't peripheral. No. The authenticated report. You never had it made. Carmen looked at her hands. Dr. Haas produced a draft. The authentication process was initiated. It was never completed. Because you told them when it was scheduled. Yes. Valentina breathed. In through the nose, 3 counts, out through the mouth. The incision pulled with every breath, and she let it pull and focused on the sensation because sensation was real and the room around her had taken on the quality of something that might not be, the quality of a thing that looks solid from a distance and turns out to have no depth at all. "The message threads," she said, "the ones proving he knew about the paternity, those are real." "Those are real. I didn't touch those." Something moved in Carmen's face. Almost something. "I wasn't going to let him take Sofia. But everything else." Silence. "The Moretti succession documents," Valentina said. "Are those in the folder?" "Yes, those are complete and authenticated. I didn't interfere with those." "Why not?" Carmen looked up at her. "Because the succession is real, and because even—" She stopped. "Some things I wouldn't do." "You did enough." "Yes." Flat, final. "I did enough." Valentina stood very still for a moment. The fluorescent light flickered. Sofia breathed. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of the building moved on without them. Then Valentina picked up her phone again. "What are you doing?" Carmen said. "What I should have done before I hired a lawyer." She found the number she wanted, pressed call, raised the phone to her ear and looked at Carmen while it rang. "Don't move. Don't open that door. Don't make a call." Carmen sat. Her hand stayed flat on the table. She had the look of someone who has accepted the arrival of a consequence they scheduled themselves. The phone rang twice. Then a man's voice, cautious, the caution of someone who doesn't recognize the number. "Yes?" "It's Valentina Moretti." She used the name deliberately, the full name, the name that meant something to the person on the other end of this call. "I need you in the building, now. 4th floor anteroom B. Come alone and come through the parking structure." A pause. "That's not how this works." "I know how it works. I also know you're in this building right now because you came here with Agent Doran and you've been waiting to see which way the proceeding went before you decided your next step. Come to the room." A longer pause. 10 minutes, the voice said. She ended the call and set the phone on the table. Carmen was watching her. Who was that? Valentina didn't answer. She pulled Sophia's carrier toward her and checked the blanket and felt the warmth and let herself have exactly 3 seconds of that. The warmth, the small breathing weight, the miniature curled fist, before she put it down and stood up straight and became again the thing she needed to be. The man who came through the door 8 minutes later was not Agent Doran. He was older than Doran, grayer, with the build of someone who had been athletic once and had let it settle into something denser and less obvious. He wore a suit that fit better than Doran's and carried nothing. No case, no folder, no visible weight. He looked at Carmen when he entered, and then he looked at Valentina. His name was Reeves. He was not FBI. He was the thing above FBI and the particular architecture of federal organized crime prosecution. The thing that didn't have a clean title on a business card. The thing that had been circling the Romano family's financial operations for 4 years through channels that didn't generate paperwork. Valentina had known he existed for 2 of those 4 years. She had known his name for 8 months, since the night she'd understood that the Geneva transfer was a setup and had started pulling threads to find out who had said it. She had found Reeves at the end of one of those threads, and she had filed him away, and she had hoped she would not need to use him. She needed to use him. Sit down, she said. He looked at the chair. He didn't sit. Where's the authenticated forensic report? Gone. Her. Valentina gestured at Carmen without looking at her. I know about the Delaware entity, the account restructuring, the controlling interest. She held his gaze. I know my name is on the original access authorization for that account, and I know what a federal prosecutor could do with that if they wanted to. Reeves said nothing. I also know, Valentina said, that you need the Moretti Network's cooperation for what you're building against Romano, not the financial records. You have those through Caruso. The cooperation, the confirmation of which alliances were Moretti brokered and which were Romano independent, because without that you can't establish the full scope of the racketeering charge, and the racketeering charge is the one that gets you asset forfeiture. She stopped. Am I wrong? You're not wrong, Reeves said. Then sit down. He sat. Carmen was very still. Here is what I need, Valentina said. The preservation order doesn't touch the Moretti succession documentation. My claim to the family holdings and the associated alliance network proceeds through the tribunal today without federal interference. In exchange, I will provide your office with a complete accounting of every Moretti brokered agreement currently embedded in Romano operations, with documentation going back 8 years, which establishes the full scope of Romano's racketeering exposure and gives you the asset forfeiture case you need. She put both hands on the table. You get Romano. I get the tribunal ruling and my daughter. Reeves looked at her for a long time, the look of a man doing complicated arithmetic. The Delaware entity, he said. The account. My access was obtained through fraudulent documentation. I can demonstrate that. Dr. Haas's draft report establishes the alteration. It's not authenticated, but it's a starting point, and I can get you 3 additional forensic specialists within 48 hours. She glanced at Carmen. And I'm giving you the person who is feeding Romano my legal strategy in real time, which constitutes obstruction and conspiracy to commit fraud, which is worth something to you independent of everything else. Carmen closed her eyes, opened them. Reeves looked at Carmen with the calm, unhurried attention of a man cataloging an asset. Then he looked back at Valentina. I need to make a call, he said. You have 5 minutes. Use the hallway. He stood, buttoned his jacket in the unconscious way of men in suits, and went to the door. Stopped. If I come back and say yes, I need the Moretti documentation within 72 hours. You'll have it in 48. He left. The door closed. Carmen said, Valentina, don't. I need you to know that I said don't. Valentina's voice came out harder than she'd planned, the edges of it sharper. She felt the incision pull as her stomach tightened and she breathed through it and held it. Whatever you need to say to feel better about what you did, say it to Reeves. I'm sure he'll find it interesting. Carmen's mouth closed. Valentina crossed to the window. It looked out onto the side of another building, brick and glass, a grid of other people's offices where other things were happening that had nothing to do with this room. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass and looked at it and thought about what came next. In 12 minutes, the recess ended. She was going to walk back into that room without her authenticated forensic report, without her attorney, and with a federal cooperation agreement that was verbal and unwritten and worth exactly as much as Reeves's word, which was worth something but not everything. She was going to walk back in, and Luca was going to be sitting at the other end of the table, and he was going to know. The moment he looked at her, he would know that something had happened in this room, because he had always been able to read her face. It was the thing about their marriage she had never been able to fully correct, so she needed to not have a face for him to read. She needed to be the thing her grandfather had taught her to be in the hardest moments, the thing he'd demonstrated once by sitting across from a man who had put a gun to his head in 1987 and had then lowered it because Enzo Moretti had looked back at him with an expression so absolutely empty of fear that the man with the gun had simply not known what to do. The absence of fear is a weapon, not courage, the deliberate performance of absence. She had it. Somewhere beneath the incision and the exhaustion and the betrayal and the sound of her daughter breathing 3 feet away. She had it. She had been built for it. The door opened. Reeves came back in. He looked at her and said, "We have a framework. The details need to be formalized, but you have my word that the preservation order will not be applied to the succession documentation." He paused. "Mrs. Romano." "Moretti," she said. He nodded. "The cooperation agreement needs to include a proffer session within the week." "Agreed." He looked at Carmen. Carmen stood up without being told and preceded him to the door and through it, and Valentina did not watch her go, did not give that departure any more of herself than it had already taken. Then she was alone in the room with her daughter. She sat down. She unlatched the carrier and lifted Sophia out, carefully, the way you lift something that is the most important thing, and held her against her chest, the baby's head beneath her chin, the weight of her settling into the specific rightness it always had, the way Valentina's body recognized this weight as its own. "Okay," she said, to Sophia, or to the room, or to no one. "Okay." She had 5 minutes. She held her daughter and breathed and let herself feel all of it, the fear, the exhaustion, the grief for Carmen, which she had not expected, and which was real regardless, the cold clarity of what she had just agreed to give Reeves, the knowledge that in 5 minutes she was going to walk back into a room where Luca Romano was waiting with the remains of his legal strategy, and a man named Caruso who had positioned himself as a federal witness, and a tribunal of men who were now understanding, for the first time, who she actually was. Not Valentina Romano, not the mafia wife, not the woman in the hospital room he hadn't come to. Valentina Moretti, Enzo's granddaughter, the heir to a network that had existed quietly underneath the world these men occupied, holding up portions of their power, unknown to them until this morning. She kissed Sophia's forehead, put her back in the carrier, stood up, checked her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman looking back at her had color high in her cheeks and eyes that were very clear, and a set to her jaw that had not been there this morning when she'd looked at herself in the elevator's metal doors downstairs. She looked like someone who had been in a fight. She looked like someone still standing. She picked up Sophia's carrier and her own bag and what remained of Carmen's folder, and she went to the door and opened it and walked out into the hallway and turned toward the proceeding room, her heels making the same deliberate sounds on the floor they had made when she arrived, and she felt every one of the 17 staples in her abdomen with every step, and she did not slow down. The proceeding room door was 10 feet away, 8 feet. She could hear voices inside, to multiple conversations breaking off as the recess neared its end. The sound of chairs, of papers, of men reorienting themselves. 5 feet. She put her hand on the door, pushed it open. The room looked up at her. All of it. Luca at the far end, jaw tight, eyes moving immediately to her face and reading nothing. Ricci in his chair, the family representatives. Castellano, the Ferraro associate. The Delacroix man who was watching her with something that had shifted in the last 30 minutes from assessment to what she was almost certain was respect. She walked to her chair, set Sophia's carrier down, set the folder down, sat. Ricci said, "Mrs. Romano, we're prepared to continue, I understand there have been some developments during the recess. Before we... I have a statement, Valentina said. Ricci stopped. Everyone stopped. She looked at Luca. He was looking back at her, and in the particular quality of his attention, the absolute focused stillness of it, she understood that he knew. Not the details, not Reeves, not the framework, not Carmen's quiet exit from the building in the company of a federal officer, but the shape of it. The fact that something had shifted in the last 30 minutes in a direction that was not going to benefit him. He knew, and he was afraid, and he was not going to show it. She recognized the performance because it was the same one she was giving. Before the recess, she said, addressing the room, I was presented with an attempt to suppress material evidence in this proceeding. That attempt has been documented and referred to federal authorities. She kept her voice level. She had practiced this sentence in the hallway. The evidence in question establishes a direct link between Romano financial operations and a federal investigation currently in progress. As of this afternoon, I have entered into a cooperation framework with that investigation. She paused. I want the parties in this room to understand what that means. It means that every agreement, every alliance, every financial channel that runs through Moretti brokered infrastructure is now subject to federal review. Not tomorrow, starting today. The Conti representative put down his water glass. The Delacroix man leaned back in his chair and said nothing and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating a very large number. Castellano leaned toward Luca and spoke rapidly in his ear. Luca did not look at him. He was looking at Valentina. You would burn everything, Luca said. His voice was very quiet. To get what you want from this proceeding. You would hand them all of it. I would protect my daughter, she said. Everything else is a consequence of the choices you made, not mine. Those men, he gestured at the representatives, their families, their operations. You'd put all of them in the federal crosshairs to... The Moretti network has operated for 40 years, Valentina said. It survived your father's war with the Contis in 1994. It survived the Eastern Seaboard crackdown in 2003. It survived you. She met his gaze. The families represented in this room are not in my cooperation agreement. Only Romano operations are in scope. And that scope was defined by you, Luca. By every time you used a Moretti channel for something I didn't authorize, every time you leveraged an alliance I built for an operation I knew nothing about. That's what's in scope. Your choices, not theirs. The room was processing this. She could feel it. The recalibration happening in real time around the table. Men doing the math, understanding that the thing they had assumed about the power distribution in this room had been wrong for years possibly, and were now determining what their position was in the new architecture. The Delacroix man caught her eye. He gave a fractional nod. Not agreement, acknowledgement. The gesture of someone who knows they are watching something that matters, and wants the person at the center of it to know they are seen. Luca's hand, flat on the table, pressed down until the knuckles whitened. What do you want? He said. Ricci started to say something about proper procedure, and Castellano shook his head once, sharply, and Ricci stopped. What do you want? Luca said again. Just to her. The room had contracted to the two of them, and the space between them and the small breathing weight of their daughter in the carrier between the chairs. Valentina looked at him. At the face she had loved and learned and spent 15 years reading and had still, at the end, not read clearly enough. The silver at his temples, the jaw, the eyes that were dark and entirely closed to her now, the way they went when he was cornered, when the calculation was running at full speed behind them. She thought about the hospital, the card, the process server, the message. She still thinks the paternity question is real, keep it that way. And the cold architectural deliberateness of it, the plan built around her fear and her isolation and her love for a child he'd claimed not to recognize. Sophia, she said, primary custody, no conditions, no supervised visits, no Romano-appointed evaluators. She held his gaze. The Moretti succession holdings, complete and uncontested. Withdrawal of all paternity challenges and a public acknowledgement within the family structure that Sophia Romano is your daughter and your heir. She paused. And your signature on a binding agreement that you will never again attempt to use her against me. Luca stared at her. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. "And if I say no," he said, "then I walk out of here with the Federal Cooperation Agreement, and Reeves's team spends the next 18 months inside every channel that touches Romano operations. And you spend that time watching everything you built come..." The sentence finished itself in the silence of the room, quiet and absolute as a door closing. Luca Romano sat at the end of the table and looked at his wife and did not speak for a long time. The ventilation system breathed for all of them. Someone down the table shifted in their chair and stopped, as if even that small movement felt like an intrusion on whatever was happening between the two people at either end of the mahogany. Then Luca looked down at his hands. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But Valentina had watched those hands for 15 years, had known them in every configuration of certainty and rage and occasional tenderness, and the specific controlled stillness he used as armor. And the way they looked right now, flat on the table, the knuckles no longer white, the fingers slightly loose, was something she had never seen before. Defeat looked different on him than she'd imagined. She had imagined it would look like anger, like the moment before violence, the compressed energy of a man who could not accept a thing and was deciding how to destroy it instead. She had prepared for that. She had run the version of this conversation where he flipped the table in her mind so many times that she could have drawn the trajectory of every water glass. What she had not prepared for was this: the hands, the looking down. Castellano put his pen on the table. He did it with the care of a man setting down something he no longer has use for. He looked at Luca and said very quietly, "Luca." Luca said, "Get out." Castellano blinked. "I need to advise you." "Marcus." Still quiet. "Get out of the room." Castellano looked at him for a moment. Then he collected his folder and his pen and his expensive education and his 20 years of keeping Romano business out of federal courtrooms, and he stood up and he left. Not in a hurry. With dignity. The dignity of a man who has just understood that his client is about to do something he cannot be present for, and has the professional sense to absent himself before it happens. The door closed. Ricci started to say something, and the Conti representative put a hand on his arm, and Ricci stopped. The room waited. Luca raised his eyes from his hands and looked at Valentina. "You would have done it," he said. Not a question. "Handed everything to Reeves." "Yes. Everything. The whole network. 40 years of..." "Yes, Luca." He breathed, in and out. She watched his chest move and thought about how strange it was to know someone's breathing patterns, to have slept beside a person long enough that their particular rhythms became known to you the way weather becomes known, the way you learn to read the pressure changes before the storm arrives. "Sophia," he said. "Yes." "You're not going to... I still get to..." He stopped. Something moved in his face, something that was not quite the thing she'd been braced for, but was in the same territory. "She's my daughter." "I know she is." "You know I know she is." His voice dropped. "You saw the message." "I saw the message. I said that because Caruso told me." He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter what Caruso told me. I said it. I put it in writing." He looked at the table. "I put it in writing about my own daughter." The room was very still. Valentina did not feel the silence. She had learned that from him, actually. The discipline of not filling silences, of letting things sit in the air until they became what they were, instead of what you tried to make them. She had learned a great deal from Luca Romano over 15 years, and she supposed that was something, even now, even here. "The custody arrangement," he said, "primary to you. I understand." He looked up. "But I need you to hear me say that I understand she's mine. I need it on the record, whatever the record is." Valentina looked at him for a long moment. "Then say it," she said. "For the record. Say it to the room." He turned. He looked at the men around the table, the family representatives, Ricci, the Ferraro associate, the Delacroix man who had not moved or spoken in 20 minutes, and was watching all of this with the patient attention of someone who has seen a great many things and is adding this to the list. "Sophia Romano," Luca said. His voice was steady. Whatever it cost him to make it steady, the cost didn't show. "Is my daughter, my blood, my heir." He paused. The paternity question was a legal tactic. It was wrong. I'm saying that here, in front of witnesses. Another pause. It was wrong. The Conti representative made a small sound. Not approval exactly. Acknowledgement. The sound of a man hearing something unexpected and adjusting his accounting. Ricci wrote something on the official proceeding record. His pen moved carefully. Luca looked back at Valentina. The Moretti Holdings, he said. I need to understand. The agreements you've been referencing. The operational channels. How much of what I built? He stopped. Rephrased. How much of what I thought I built was yours? She considered how to answer this. She had thought about this question in the abstract for years. The question of what was his and what was hers, and what was the thing they had made together before everything calcified into positions and resentments. She had thought about it and never arrived at a clean answer because the truth was not clean. The foundation was yours, she said. The Bronx operations, the port contracts, the first tier of East Coast Alliance, that was all Romano built before me. She kept her voice even, factual. What I added was the international layer, the Geneva channels, the Moretti family connections in 4 cities that translated into operational access you couldn't have bought, the introduction to the Delacroix network. She glanced at the man from New Orleans who gave nothing away. Those things were mine, and they were real, Luca. I wasn't performing usefulness. I was genuinely invested in what we were building. Until you weren't. Until you made it impossible to be. He absorbed that. Didn't argue it. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The not arguing. He had argued everything for 15 years. Everything. She had once watched him argue the weather forecast with a meteorologist at a charity dinner and win on a technicality. Caruso, he said. What about him? He came to you about the transfer. It wasn't a question, but it also wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of a man rearranging a story he'd been told and comparing it to a story he was now seeing. He told me you'd approached him, that you were trying to move Moretti assets out of reach before the divorce proceedings. He told you I approached him? Yes. And you believed him? A beat. I wanted to believe him. That landed differently than she'd expected. She sat with it for a moment, the wanting to believe. The difference between being deceived and choosing to be deceived because the deception aligned with what you needed to be true. She knew something about that. She had wanted to believe for years that the marriage was repairable, that the distance between them was circumstantial rather than structural, that it was the stress of his work, the pressure of maintaining an empire, the inevitable friction of 2 strong personalities in close quarters for a long time. She had wanted to believe it. She had not wanted to believe it badly enough to stop watching clearly. Caruso set us both up, she said. Luca's jaw moved. The transfer. He brought it to me using altered documentation and your real signature. He told me you'd authorized it. He told me the account was still Moretti controlled. None of it was true. The account had been restructured. The controlling entity was Carmen's shell company. The transfer established a paper trail that connected both of us to a fraudulent transaction through a channel that looked, from the outside, like a coordinated Romano Moretti operation. He wanted both of us exposed. He wanted leverage over both of us. Independent federal exposure he could trade separately to each of us to stay operational. She looked at the table. He'd been planning it for longer than either of us knew. Carmen was part of it from the beginning. She was his inside line to my legal strategy and his connection to the Delaware entity. They built it together. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different voice, lower, stripped of the tribunal quality, the performance of power quality, just a voice. I didn't know Carmen was compromised. I know. Valentina, I didn't send her to you. I want that on the record too. I did a great many things in this proceeding that I should not have done. He paused. I did not plant your attorney. She believed him. She wasn't sure she wanted to believe him, but she did, because she knew the specific shape of Luca's ruthlessness, and it had a consistency to it, a pattern she had documented in her own mind over 15 years. And Carmen's infiltration didn't fit the pattern. It was too patient, too structural, too willing to wait. Luca's ruthlessness was direct. It wanted results it could see. Caruso had played a longer game than either of them. He's in federal custody by now, she said. Reeves moved that fast? He was already positioned. He's been building toward Romano for 4 years. Caruso handed him the transfer documentation and his own testimony in exchange for a cooperation deal. Reeves needed Caruso processed and secured before the proceeding ended, so Caruso couldn't change his mind. She paused. Carmen too, probably. Reeves had someone waiting. Luca looked at the table again. So Caruso gets a deal. A reduced one. He'll still see federal time. And Carmen. Obstruction, conspiracy, fraud. She kept her voice flat. She made her choices. He nodded, slowly. Ricci cleared his throat. The sound of a man who has been holding a great deal of procedural concern in check for the last 20 minutes and can no longer entirely contain it. I believe we're in a position to proceed to the settlement terms, he said carefully. Given what has been presented today, and given Mr. Romano's statements for the record, I would suggest we work toward a formal agreement that addresses. I'll sign, Luca said. Ricci stopped. The terms Valentina outlined. He looked at Ricci. Primary custody, no conditions. Moretti's succession uncontested. Acknowledgement of Sophia's status. The binding agreement. He looked at Valentina. I'll sign. The Delacroix man, who had been silent for the better part of an hour, said quietly, Mr. Romano, you understand what you're conceding in terms of the alliance structure. Luca looked at him. Yes. Several of those channels, I understand, Edouard. He used the man's first name. The Delacroix man, Edouard, received this with a small nod. The channels that run through Moretti infrastructure will need to be renegotiated. That's between our families, and it will happen through legitimate intermediaries, and it will take time. He paused. I'm not in a position to fight this today, and I'm not. Another pause, longer. I'm not willing to keep fighting it. Edouard Delacroix looked at Valentina. And the Moretti Network's position, going forward, in terms of those agreements? The Moretti Network, Valentina said, will honor existing agreements through the end of the current contract cycles. Renegotiation will proceed in good faith. She met his eyes. I have no interest in burning down structures that don't need to burn. My interest was always in this room. She looked at Luca. In what was mine? Edouard Delacroix sat back in his chair. He looked for a moment like a man arriving at the end of a very long calculation and finding that the number, while unexpected, was acceptable. Then I think we have a basis, he said, to the room in general, to no one in particular. The Conti representative picked up his water glass. The Ferraro associate put his phone away. Ricci began the formal procedure of drawing up the settlement terms with the relieved efficiency of a man who can see the end of a very long day from where he's standing. Valentina sat and listened to the procedural language and felt the room reorganize itself around the new shape of things. And she breathed, and she felt the staples in her abdomen pulling less than they had an hour ago, or maybe the same amount, but she had less attention to give them. She looked at Sophia. The baby was awake. Had been awake, it seemed, for some time. Lying in the carrier with her eyes open, the dark, unfocused gaze of a 7-day-old doing whatever 7-day-olds do with the information their eyes collect, which is not seen exactly, but is the beginning of the process of learning what the world looks like. She was looking at the light from the window, the winter afternoon light that fell across the table and the carrier and the edge of her cream blanket. Valentina watched her daughter look at the light. She thought about something her grandfather had told her that she had not thought about in years. Something he'd said not in the study, not in the formal teaching voice, but once in the garden of the Connecticut house, when she was maybe 11 and he was old and they were just sitting. He had said, "The hardest thing is not the fighting. I fought for 50 years and the fighting was never the hardest thing. The hardest thing is knowing what you fought for and not losing it in the years after." She had not understood it then. She had thought it was something old people said, the generalizations of a long life reduced to sayable shapes. She understood it now. She reached into the carrier and found Sophia's hand. The tiny fist uncurled slightly around her finger with the reflexive trust of a creature who has not yet learned not to trust. And Valentina held on and looked at the light and let the room do its procedural work around her. It took another 2 hours. The settlement was drafted, reviewed, amended in 4 places that Valentina identified, and 2 that the Delacroix man's counsel identified on behalf of the allied family's interests, and then signed. Luca's signature was the same as it always had been, bold, slightly compressed, the signature of a man who signs things quickly because he has always had a great many things to sign. She had not seen it on a document in over a year, and she felt nothing when she saw it except the clean, specific relief of a thing concluded. She signed her own name as Valentina Moretti, not Romano. Ricci noted the discrepancy. She told him it was not a discrepancy. He wrote it down. The family representatives departed in the ordered sequence of men who have places to be and have already begun mentally moving toward them. Edouard Delacroix paused beside Valentina on his way out and said, in a voice pitched only for her, "Your grandfather would have found today instructive." He said it without inflection, which meant it was a compliment, and moved on. The Conti representative shook her hand. Briefly, formally. He had known her for 9 years as Luca's wife, and he was recalibrating the entire relationship in real time, and she could see him doing it, could see the reassessment behind his eyes, the shifting of a long-held position in the architecture of his understanding. She let him recalibrate. It would take time. That was fine. Ricci left without making eye contact with anyone, which was its own form of survival. The room emptied. Luca stayed. He sat at his end of the table, and she sat at hers, and the distance between them was the length of a very long marriage and a great deal of damage, and also, underneath both of those things, the particular and unresolvable fact of a child who was going to spend her life moving between them. Valentina looked at him, and he looked back, and for a long time neither of them spoke. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to—" "Good." A pause. "I know what I did." "Do you?" He looked at the table. "I know what I did," he said again, differently. Not for the room, just said. "The hospital, the process server, the message about the paternity." He stopped. "She almost died, Valentina. You almost—" His voice changed register, went somewhere rougher. "Marco called me when they took you into surgery. I was in the car. I didn't—" He stopped again. She waited. "I didn't come," he said. "I know I didn't come. I've—" The sentence didn't finish. He pressed his fingers against the table. "I've thought about it." "I'm sure you have." "That's not— I'm not asking for—" "I know what you're not asking for." She kept her voice steady. There were things she could say. A great many things, accumulated over 6 months of lying in the dark and thinking about what she would say if she ever had this conversation. If he ever sat across from her in a room without lawyers performing and was just a man who had done things. She could say all of them. She had the language for every one. "I'm not going to give you the conversation where you tell me you thought about it, and I tell you whether that's enough." She picked up Sophia's carrier. "It's not a conversation I'm going to have. Not today, and I don't think any day." He nodded, looked at Sophia. The look on his face when he looked at his daughter was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him in years, and she registered it and filed it away. Not as evidence of something good exactly, but as evidence of something real, which was different and smaller, but not nothing. "She'll know me," he said. Not a question. A check. "She'll know you," Valentina said. "She's going to know exactly who her father is. I'm not going to take that from her, or from you." She looked at him. "What she knows will depend on who you are when she's old enough to know things. That part is up to you." He absorbed this. She saw it go in and do whatever it did. She stood. She picked up the folder. She picked up her bag. She picked up Sophia's carrier with the careful deliberateness that had not changed since she'd walked into this room 4 hours ago. The same careful deliberateness of a woman who will not let the effort show, but will also not put the child down. She walked the length of the table. When she passed him, she didn't stop. She had thought she might. She had thought there would be something, some final thing that needed to be said or seen or exchanged at close range before this part of her life concluded. There wasn't. Or rather, there was, but it lived somewhere below the level of language, and she wasn't going to go digging for it in this room on this day. She reached the door. Luca said, "Valentina." She stopped. She did not turn around. "For what it's worth," he said. I knew, from the beginning, what you were. A pause. I think I chose not to be afraid of you, and I think that was the mistake. She stood at the door and considered this for a moment. It was, she said, and pushed through. The hallway was quiet. The afternoon had moved on while they were inside. The light from the windows at the far end had gone from winter white to winter gold, the particular exhausted color of a short day giving out. Her heels made the same sounds on the floor. She walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button, and while she waited, she looked at Sophia, who was looking at the gold light from the windows with the same absorbed attention she'd given the white light earlier. And Valentina thought, "You're going to be someone who looks at light. I can already tell. You're going to be someone who notices things." The elevator came. She stepped in. The doors closed. For 4 floors, she stood in the small mirrored box with her daughter and her folder and the remains of the day and let herself feel it. Not perform, not feeling it. Actually feel it. The exhaustion that went to the bone and below. The specific grief of ending something that had also been real, that had also contained years of genuine things before it contained this. The staples, the relief, large and shapeless, the kind that doesn't announce itself as joy but just sits there like a stone removed from a long-carried weight. The lobby opened around her. She walked through it, through the glass doors, out into the cold. The car was there. A different car than she'd arrived in, this one arranged through a channel Carmen had never known about, driven by a man who had worked for her grandfather and then, quietly, for her. He got out when he saw her and opened the rear door without speaking, and she got in, and he closed it and got back behind the wheel and pulled into traffic. She held Sophia against her chest. The baby's head was under her chin. Warm. The specific warmth of a living thing that fits against you, like it was built for the purpose. Outside the window, the city moved past. Late afternoon, December. The streets full of people doing the ordinary commerce of a cold day who had no idea what had happened 43 floors above them, what had been decided, what had ended, what had not quite ended, what would continue in new and different forms for years to come. The people moved, the lights changed, the river appeared between buildings for one moment and then was gone. She had work to do. The proffer session with Reeves within the week, the Moretti documentation for federal cooperation, 48 hours. The renegotiation of the Allied family agreements, which would take months and would require a kind of sustained, focused political skill that she had not had to exercise openly in 15 years. Legal formalization of the settlement terms, arrangements for the supervised transfer of certain Romano operational agreements back to their structural foundations. All of it waiting, patient, enormous. She knew how to do all of it. She had always known. That had been the thing she'd kept in a locked room inside herself, not because she doubted it, but because she had believed for a long time that the locked room and the marriage could coexist, that she could be both things, the woman in the marriage and the woman in the locked room. She had been wrong about that. Or not wrong exactly. She had been that for a long time. She just hadn't understood that the coexistence had an expiration, that eventually the two things would press against each other hard enough that one of them would have to give. The marriage had given. What was left was her. And Sophia, small and warm and currently asleep against her chest, who had come into existence in the narrow gap between the end of one thing and the beginning of another, and who knew nothing about any of it, and who would, someday, know everything about all of it, and who deserved, above everything, before everything, a mother who had not lost herself in the negotiation of her own survival. She had not lost herself. She checked. Right now, in the back of the car with the city going past and the day finally ending, she checked. The way you check after a fall, not for the obvious damage, but for the things that might only announce themselves later. She went through herself carefully, looking for what was missing, what had been given away that could not be recovered. The Moretti network was intact, and now operating openly under her name. The legal acknowledgement of Sophia's status was on record. The settlement was signed. Carmen was gone. That would hurt later, in the specific dull way that betrayal always hurts later, after the immediate practical emergency has been managed, and there's space for the personal damage to present itself. She had trusted Carmen for 3 years. That trust had been used. That would need to be processed, and she was not going to do it today. Luca's voice at the door. "I knew what you were. I chose not to be afraid. She thought about that for a moment, turned it over, put it down. The car turned onto a quieter street. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, just a glance, checking, and she met his eyes and gave a small nod, and he looked back at the road. She was going home. Not the house in Westchester from the settlement document, the residence held in trust with the Romano family attorney's fingerprints on the deed. That was an address. She was going to the apartment she had arranged 4 months ago under a name connected to the Moretti Trust, in a building on the Upper West Side where the doorman had been employed by her grandfather's network since 1998, and where the security was exceptional, and where there were 2 furnished rooms, one of which she had spent 6 months imagining Sophia sleeping in. That was home. It would do for now. It would do for as long as she needed it to do, and then she would build something else, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done, quietly, under the surface of every other version of herself she had been required to perform. She built things. The apartment was on the 14th floor. The windows faced west. She had thought about those windows often, about what it would feel like to stand at them with her daughter and watch the sun go down over the river on an ordinary evening when no one was watching and nothing was required. She had thought about ordinary evenings the way people think about water when they're thirsty, not romantically, but with a specific physical ache for the basic thing. She would have ordinary evenings now, some of them. Between the work and the negotiations and the legal processes and the years of careful navigation that lay ahead. In the spaces between those things, there would be ordinary evenings, and she intended to be present for all of them. Sophia shifted against her chest. A small sound. The beginning of hunger, the first signal, the one that preceded the real cry by about 4 minutes if Valentina had learned her daughter's rhythms correctly, which in 7 days she had. She pressed her lips against Sophia's forehead. Outside the window, the river appeared again. The last light on it was flat and gold and cold and beautiful in the specific way of things that don't care whether they're beautiful or not, that simply are, that simply persist through the days regardless of what happens in the rooms above them. The woman who had walked into a tribunal chamber 6 hours ago carrying a newborn and 17 surgical staples and everything she knew about power and survival sat in the back of a car moving north through the last of the afternoon light and held her daughter and breathed and did not look back at the tower they had left behind. It was still there. So was she. That was the whole of it. That was the sum and the substance and the thing that no one who hadn't lived through it could fully account for. Not the victory, not the documents, not the network or the name or the federal cooperation agreement or the settlement signed in Luca Romano's compressed bold hand. Just the being still there. The car moved north. The light failed slowly, the way winter light always fails, grudgingly, giving ground inch by inch until all at once it was gone. Sophia made her small sound again, slightly more urgent, right on schedule. The driver was 3 blocks from the building. Valentina held on, and the city held them both, indifferent and enormous and full of people who did not know her name, either of her names, and in whose ordinary noise and movement and winter cold she was going to build, from the ground up without hiding any of it, the life she had been saving herself for.